Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I'll be your host for today. So February has been a pretty awesome month so far. Every February for the last 4 or 5 years, we've kicked all the men out and we host exclusively women in science, adventure, exploration, and conservation. So this February has been another awesome month. We've hosted over 50 live events with amazing women scientists, explorers, conservationists, and adventurers from all over the world. And sadly, we are at our final day, but we still have another couple events for your classrooms. So really excited today to be joined by Keir. She is a geographer, conservationist, and 2019 National Geographic Storytelling Grantee, whose research focuses on wildlife crime and the poaching crisis in South Africa. So with her NGS grant, she's investigating the socioeconomic drive of income potential behind rhino poaching within Greater Kruger in South Africa. So through mapping, storytelling, photography, and art, she's working to elevate the voices of local rangers and individuals living alongside the rhino who experience the effects of this illicit trade firsthand. So Tara, it's always great to have you joining us live from DC today at National Geographic headquarters. We're excited to get to know you a little bit better today.
Awesome. Well, hey, everybody. It's really great to meet you all. Hold on. Let me make sure I get this sound turned off. Yeah, thanks for the kind introduction, Joe. If I'm being honest with you, it still sounds pretty strange to me to have someone reading out my work and especially introducing me with the titles that you just heard. You know, I've always had kind of a hard time proposing a title for myself to people for situations like this. I always think, you know, am I a geographer because that's what I'm trained in and what I studied? Am I a conservationist because that's what I have a passion for and a drive for? Am I a Nat Geo explorer because, for one, it sounds really cool, and two, that's the grant work that I'm doing? Or am I, you know, a journalist because that's my most recent endeavor and what I'm honestly, you know, aspiring to be right now? Because at some point in my life, every single one of those titles has been an aspiration for me. They've always been a goal. And now that some of them actually apply, it still feels very surreal. And it also reminds me that there's maybe some titles coming up in my future that I don't even know exist yet, which is pretty exciting. So I'm hoping that today I'll get a chance to give you guys a little bit of information about how my journey to where I am kind of happened, and also leave you guys understanding a little bit more about the poaching crisis. But before we get started, I'm dying to know, and hopefully you guys can show me by hands, but how many of you, like who in here feels a bit like I did when I was younger and has no real idea of what they want to be when they grow up? I'm seeing some hands come up. Okay, I'm glad I wasn't alone when I was young. And even for those of you who do know what you want to be when you grow up, who still has no idea how to get there? Maybe some more hands coming up. Okay. So I can tell you there's one thing that I've come to learn in my 27 years of life. It's that that's okay. This is honestly how I felt my entire life, and I've come to embrace it and all of the uncertainties that come with it. And you're probably wondering why. For one, I mean, it got me here, so it seemed to have worked out. It's because of one realization I discovered when I stepped back and asked myself one really simple question. And that question was, Tara, have you found something that you love? And my answer to that was very easy. I said, yes, I love elephants. And over the years, that love of elephants, which was, you know, what instantly came to my mind, evolved over the years and through my experiences to be embracing a love for all wildlife, conserving species, and I ended up developing a really big interest and love in understanding the threats that face the species that I love, and also understanding what's impacting them and their future on this planet. But I realized, you know, like once you find something that you love and care about enough, you don't have to stress so much about the big, scary how you're going to get to that end goal of what you want to be when you grow up. And that love will help guide you there. So for me, I decided to study geography in undergrad, and I focused my senior thesis on elephant conservation biogeography, which sounds like a mouthful, but I got a really good look at what was happening with my beloved elephants and in the world of conservation and how they interact with humans. But it wasn't until after college that I got an internship with National Geographic where I was introduced to the world of poaching. And I quickly realized that I had found a place to really focus my love for wildlife and also elephants a little bit indirectly because I ended up focusing on rhino, but we'll get to that. But I am going to right now switch over to images so you can stop looking at my face and kind of have some better visuals moving forward. So let me get that set up. Let me share that screen.
Right, so far so good.
Whoops, sorry, hold on. Let me press play. Okay, so you're seeing my screen now, correct?
Perfect, we gotcha.
Perfect. Okay, so this is kind of the moment where I decided that I realized I can no longer be the girl who simply loves elephants. I can't be this girl who you're seeing in this photo right here anymore. Instead, what I needed to do is become this girl. I needed to become the girl out in the bush playing my part in the fight against wildlife crime. And so what I've done here is really start to think about the scary how am I going to be able to do that? And so I needed to fully understand the threats that these animals that I love face in order to take action to change their future, even if in just some really small way. So at this point, that big question of how do I get there came into play. And I decided I could take control over what I could. And I, instead of worrying about it, just decided let's dive straight on in and try to learn everything that I can. So I dove head in on understanding all things wildlife crime, read everything that I could, and I had a more pointed determination at that point, to be involved in being a part of the solution to the poaching crisis. And this is also around the time that I decided that part of my how would be applying for a National Geographic grant. But at that time, I still had no idea what it was that I was going to apply. I only knew that it would be about the poaching crisis. So I still had a lot to learn. So the next logical step to me was also one that absolutely terrified me, but in the best way possible. And I don't know if any of you have experienced a moment like that yet in your lives, but I'm sure a time will come where you have a decision to make and you will feel terrified, but you'll understand what I mean when I say it's in the best way possible. It's in a very exciting way. And, this was one of those moments for me where I decided that I was going to take my future into my own hands and go to Africa by myself and spend time with 5 anti-poaching units. And in that moment, when I look back on how scared I was, it was actually a good sign, because I think that for those moments where you feel that amazing mix of terrifying excitement, it's a moment where it's a telltale sign that you're on the right track because you're doing something you really, really believe in and really care about. And so I did plan this month-long trip to Africa. Here's a first image, and I'm going to scroll through a bunch to kind of show you what I was doing during that month-long time period before I even knew what my grant was going to be about. I made a point to spend time with the people on the ground who were actually involved with the poaching crisis that I knew I wanted to write about and research. So I asked everyone as many questions as possible. I spent time going on patrols with anti-poaching units like you see here. I spent time with them out in the bush, and I saw where they were actually staying when they were out in pickets, where they were kind of waiting, spending time in the bush, trying to protect wildlife at the same time as trying to make sure there weren't poachers entering the parks. I also spent time learning about the canine units that these teams operate with, and came to the realization that, the catching of poachers doesn't really happen without the use of dogs as our friends, and also as, a bunch of senses that we can't tap into. I also spent time, at dawn tracking rhino, and ended up finding a white rhino and her calf in the middle of the bush with this team of with this team of amazing people. This is one of the rhinos that we ended up seeing. And I also spent time at a rhino sanctuary where I saw just exactly how much trauma the poaching crisis leaves in its wake, especially when it comes to these little orphaned rhinos. And so after spending time, even training alongside of these guys, you can see me trying to keep up doing push-ups. I don't know if I was doing a very good job, but seeing how these guys go through their training practices as well, I walked away understanding one thing more than anything else. And it was that one of the main reasons poaching is still happening is because of insider involvement or inside jobs. And to me, inside jobs up until this point had never been something I'd really talked about or thought of. And the word informant to me was more of someone giving information to help rangers rather than the other way around. So when I realized that things were happening the other way around, where informants and insiders were actually helping poachers, that is when I realized, there's a very interesting story here. And I think it's something that I want to focus on. So that's when I discovered the focus of my future grant. And so today, I'm very excited to talk to you about wildlife crime in general and my current storytelling grant with National Geographic, which, as Joe mentioned, is focusing on poaching that's happening in Kruger in South Africa, specifically around rhino poaching. But before I dive in, let's talk a little bit first about wildlife crime. So this image right here is one that I took from my first trip to South Africa, and these are rhino skulls. They're skulls of poached rhino that were outside of an APU, an anti-poaching unit office. And I want this slide up when I talk about wildlife crime because this is a direct result of it. Wildlife crime in general has a very broad description of being the violation of a criminal law that's actually designed to protect wildlife. But that can encompass a lot of things, and it does. But one of the most common and problematic forms of wildlife crime is poaching. And as most of you probably are aware, poaching is the illegal killing of wildlife or wild resources. And that includes both plants and animals, flora and fauna. So before I go even further, show of hands, how many of you have heard of the rhino poaching crisis that's happening? Cool, a lot of hands going up, I see. All right, now I want to follow that up with another question. I'm curious what you've been taught about it. What are your views on the poachers themselves? Do you believe that the poachers are truly the root of the problem? Does killing a poacher help put an end to rhino poaching? And now I know that sounds like maybe a harsh question to bring up, but I ask it for a very specific reason. And that's because that's a question that I'm constantly reminding myself to ask. And it's been driving my research. Because when we look at how the media covers rhino poaching and poaching in general, we see a lot that paints a picture that's very one-sided, that often depicts these poachers, the ones who are out there killing the wildlife, as the bad guys, right? We think that they're the ones that are causing the problem because that's what all these stories are focusing on. But what if we're focusing our energy on the wrong people? Dead poachers are not the solution. And I've asked this question countless times and been told over and over by rangers, by people involved on the ground in South Africa, head on with this issue. So those same people that I just showed you in images before, time and time again telling me that a dead poacher is not the solution here. So from the very beginning of my work, even before I started this grant research, I have found it necessary to focus on actually trying to understand why these individuals who poach choose to kill wildlife in the first place, and also trying to figure out how to help people far away from the problem. So like ourselves here in the United States and Canada, overseas, who feel very much removed from the situation, I'm trying to also find out a way to help this crowd feel informed and also empowered to involve ourselves in being part of the solution. And so with my Nat Geo grant, I'm going to try to situate you guys a bit right now with this map. So I'm sure you guys know what the continent of Africa looks like. So you're seeing that on the left-hand side of this image. South Africa is where I'm doing my grant research, and that's in the southernmost part of the continent. And you can see on the left, I've put a box in a zoomed in photo of map of South Africa, a box around what's called Kruger National Park. And so that's more specifically where I'm doing my research. And here is a slide that kind of gives you a bigger picture of what Kruger National Park itself looks like closer in. I also have a drawing and painting of mine to the left because I've been incorporating artwork into a lot of my grant work. So I thought it'd be a nice filler because it's a very vertical map. So now you get two versions. So South Africa is where I'm doing my work, but I'm really focused in Kruger. And Kruger itself, so you guys get a sense of how big it is. It's massive. It is 2 million hectares. And I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, what the heck is a hectare? A single hectare is about the size of a standard sports field. So if you picture 2 million, football fields side by side, that's the size of Kruger National Park. But that's full of wildlife. So think of it full of both black and white rhino roaming the park. It also has elephants, leopards, lions, hyena. It's full of the works of African wildlife, but it is a bit more complicated than that. So I'm showing you a couple of photos that I took over my research this summer. Apologize, I took this through my very dirty windshield of my rattle trap of a vehicle. So you can see some specks there, but this is what Kruger National Park looks like when you're driving through it. And so, oftentimes, elephants are crossing your path on a paved road. You're also seeing maybe a baby here and there. Some hyenas coming, across your path early in the morning. But there's a lot more going on in the park that you don't necessarily see. So aside from the gorgeous wildlife, which I couldn't help but put a couple of photos in here of elephants, even though that's not what we're talking about, there's beautiful bird species. There's so much life to enjoy inside the park, but there's a lot that you're not thinking of as a part of Kruger as well. You have a lot of concessions. There's a lot of rest camps that are full of staff throughout the park. You also have over maybe 1,000 different safari companies coming in and out of the park with travelers every day. You also have maintenance vehicles coming in and out of the park. And you also have normal tourists, park staff. You also have rangers. So there's a whole bunch of things happening inside Kruger that don't necessarily have anything to do with wildlife. So I want you to keep in mind all those critical things that are happening inside Kruger National Park. The park is also home to one of the largest populations of wild rhino that are left in the world. So as you can imagine, this makes it a really big hotspot for poaching. But before I get too far, you guys must be wondering too, why do people even want to kill rhino for its horn? And so there's something called the black market, which is the illegal trade of commodities. And in this case, we're talking specifically about the illegal market for wildlife products. So consumers in Southeast Asia, including Vietnam and China, are buying rhino horn for multiple reasons, but it's mostly centered around their desire to have it for a medicinal value or as a remedy to something. And so they're currently, using it for all sorts of things, consuming it as a hangover cure, as a potential cure for cancer, but as an aphrodisiac. But there's no scientific proof that backs any of this being used as medicine. And rhino horn is actually made of the same things as our hair and nails. It's made of keratin. So essentially, someone who's consuming rhino horn could actually, chew on their own nail and get a similar effect, right? If it was scientifically backed, but it's not. But regardless, now rhino horn on the black market is worth something like over $65,000 per kilogram. It's worth more than its weight in gold. So we're seeing it also used as a status symbol. So of course, with something that has this high of a value, there is a very complex crime ring behind this type of illegal trade, which is full of syndicates and kingpins and poachers. And these syndicates have had to change their tactics over the years in order to continue poaching rhino for the black market. But in my research, I've noticed something that most people may not be aware of, simply given by the information that's made available to them. So let's go back to the picture that's painted by the media that we're talking about. A lot of times we use sensationalized language that talks about a battle for rhino, and it very much depicts this crossfire between poachers and rangers trying to protect wildlife. But in all of these stories, we're still hearing about high numbers of poaching happening. And it leaves us with the image that, if the poaching is still happening at such a high rate, doesn't that mean that the anti-poaching units and the rangers aren't doing a good job at catching the poachers? And that's a very common misconception, because the reality of the situation is that these rangers are doing an incredible job at catching poachers, but the system is stacked against them, and there are a lot of challenges that they face that add up to why rhino poaching is still happening at the rates that it is. And I realized the current stories that we tell to the public is not helping people to dig deep enough into the story. The reality of the situation is that rangers are up against much harsher realities than and challenges than we think otherwise. And so I'm trying to more broadly break down this incredibly complicated situation and not allow the complexity of it to scare us away from actually trying to wrap our heads around what's actually happening. But it's more than just thinking that through. It's trying to think through, what are all the pieces of information we need to consider the whole picture? Because the story of rhino poaching is much more than just a wildlife story, right? There's so many human elements involved. And so that's why with my approach to this current story I'm working on is to really focus on that human angle of the story and what's driving the poaching crisis, and shed some light on that. So in reality, what you're seeing in this picture is some anti-poaching unit rangers actually doing a night patrol, looking alongside fence lines to make sure that there's no signs of entry from poachers coming in from the outside. And the reason I'm showing you this image is that because the reality of what's happened is that rangers have gotten so good at their jobs that poachers and syndicates have had to change how they have access to rhino. They used to be able to enter the parks from outside via fence lines through something we call incursions. But rangers have gotten good at keeping these poachers out. They're not able to get in through fence lines anymore. So they've had to be creative and think through a new way to get people into the park to be able to poach rhino. And so what's happening is that syndicates and these poachers are now trying to recruit individuals from inside the park for information. And now remember what I told you about the parks. There are a lot of people working inside Kruger. There are safari guides from outside companies. There are people from towns coming in as tourists. There's maintenance vehicles. There's people who work at the nursery where they're growing plants inside the park. And there are rangers themselves. And these individuals, because they're working in an area that has a high probability that they have access to information on where the rhino are located in the park, they're being approached by poaching syndicates and asked to become informants to help them in their endeavor to poach rhino. And the main question here is, well, why would someone whose livelihood is to protect rhino ultimately decide to share information with the very people who are going to go in and kill rhino? And the big driver here is money. And that's where we get to the socioeconomic drive behind the poaching crisis. Why are people killing wildlife in the first place? And it's driven by money. But it's hard for us to put ourselves in the shoes of individuals who are living very different lives than us and are approached with a very difficult decision of making more money than they could in their entire year at their current job just by helping with one poaching incident. So while I can't get too detailed into my current project since it's still ongoing, I can dive into a little bit more of the scary, what do you want to be when you grow up moment that I had while I was doing my grant work this summer in South Africa. And it was a moment where I realized, oh my gosh, the work I'm doing is actually more something that an investigative journalist does. And I kind of panicked because I'm not someone who's gone to school for journalism, right? You guys heard, I went to college, I studied geography, I loved elephants. I didn't take a class on journalism. I didn't take a class on interviewing people. But here I was in South Africa coming to the realization that my grant work as a geographer was actually more closely aligned with investigative journalism. So instead of letting that freak me out, well, it did for a second, but instead of letting it stop me from doing and carrying out my grant work, I realized that I could remind myself, Tara, remind yourself of that thing you love, which is now transformed into this passion to be involved in making an impact in the rhino poaching crisis, and let that carry you forward. And I kind of had a lot of moments during this grant research where I realized that I gained access to a story I might not have otherwise tapped into because of my drive to find out information, because I cared, and because I had a genuine interest in making sure I could play a role in bettering the situation. And so I have, 7+ notebooks full of my chicken scratch from countless interviews. I talked to everyone I could. Here's a photo of me actually driving through some of the towns with a few individuals who work inside the park, showing me actual homes that we're seeing being built up from money that people have made poaching rhino, which was a very sobering moment. But I spent time with everyone who'd speak with me. And I really tried to tackle the story angles. And here's a photo of me. It's probably like the only photo of me out doing my grant work, but I'm speaking with one of the rangers inside Kruger in this very photo outside of the home that he lives in. And, throughout this entire journey, even though I'm not an investigative journalist by education, I would say, I really dove head on into the role. And I think I walked away now knowing that I am an investigative journalist. And it's because framing the story, figuring out how to take the time to look into not only the lives of the people you're speaking with and really taking the time to listen, but it's also doing the research, looking at the environmental history of a place, the political history of a place, the economic history of a place, in an effort to try and understand why the situation is the way that it is, which is especially important when you're entering a situation where you're completely removed. I'm someone from the United States, right? I'm not living alongside rhino. I'm not dealing with the poaching crisis every day. I'm not a ranger who's out there putting my life on the line. So it was really important to me to hear every perspective I could to get a better idea of what's been going on with the poaching crisis, and also figure out how I can help tell a story that we in the rest of the world have been missing, and help us give, the rangers that are on the ground a bit more support and a bit more of what they need to keep this fight going. So I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen now before I wrap up, if this will work. Hold on. Oops. I can't see. There we go. But I hope that, while we've been chatting, I hope that you guys have learned a little bit about the poaching crisis. But I think more than anything, I'm hoping that while rhino poaching and conservation might not be your love that you found in your life, I hope that you guys will take the time, maybe after this chat's over, to step back, and instead of asking yourself the scary question of what you want to be when you grow up, instead, maybe you'll be able to ask yourself, have I found something that I love? And then when you find the answer to that, take that answer and run with it, with all you've got. Because you can go in some pretty incredible directions when you stop stressing so hard about the how you're going to get there and just kind of go for it. So, all right, well, that's going to be me wrapping it up.
All right, awesome. Well, Tara, thank you so much for sharing that story with us, but also that really good advice that it's okay not to know what you want to do right now, but it's also okay to know what you want to do, but not how yet. And you're right, you've just got to go for it, and good things tend to happen. And I think your story is a really good example of that. All right, well, let's start meeting some of our classrooms. We're gonna give a quick shout out to our YouTube groups. Don't forget, you can send in some questions via the chat sidebar. I know we've got Mrs. Crossland's group hanging out in San Antonio, Texas. We've got Mrs. Brohart 6'7" in Massey, Ontario. Looks like we also have a group in New Albany, Ohio. So lots of groups tuning in on YouTube.
Wow.
Open up for those questions, but let's get to some of our live groups. So let's start off. We're going to go to Windsor, Ontario here in Canada to start. Mr. Tiro's got a group of students hanging out with him. Let's get that microphone on. How are we doing, Windsor? I think they're there. Oh, there they are.
Thank you.
All right, the microphone's just a little bit quiet, so whoever has a question, if they can come nice and close for us.
Tell who you are.
Oh, I'm on the screen.
Yeah, right
okay.
there.
Nice and loud.
In 50 years from now, where do you think the state of poaching will be in South Africa?
Did you say in 50 or 15?
Like 50 in the future.
In the future? That's a tough question, but I think that it's important to always answer that a bit optimistic. I honestly think that with people like myself and all the people that I've met in Kruger through my research, that there are a lot of great efforts going on to combat the poaching crisis. But I think so long as we can get the rest of the world tuned in to the issue beyond just having a love for a species, right? Right now, I think there's a lot of people who love rhino. But a lot of those people who love rhino don't truly know what's happening with the current situation. And that's not necessarily their fault, right? Because we've talked about the type of information you can find in the media is not necessarily telling you the challenges that rangers are facing. But I think that through educating, the general public throughout the world, maybe we'll be able to get a kind of global community support for these rangers who basically we have a small handful of rangers in these parks in Africa who are bearing the entire responsibility of saving a species on their shoulder because they're the ones boots on the ground in the bush every day protecting that species. But I think that, all of us in the world can play a much bigger role in that. We can, make sure people are educated about what's happening and maybe even take some further action down the line for pushing governments in Africa to make some changes. We've seen it be successful in other cases, so I don't see why we can't play a role in that too. And that's kind of what I can't get too deep into it with my grant work, but I'm hoping that that'll play a bigger role in maybe helping the future seem a bit more bright.
All right, great question to get us started. We're going to go to Aurelia now in Ontario. We've got some students hanging out with Mr. Bernie. Let me get their microphone turned on.
Okay.
There it is. How are we doing, Aurelia?
Good. Is there a way to bring back the white rhino?
Is there a way to bring back the white rhino?
Yeah.
So I think you're talking about the northern white rhino, right? Because there's two different types of white rhinos. And I spend a lot of time with southern white rhinos, which there's a quite a large population of them still in Africa. The northern white rhino, I don't have as much detailed information about since that's not true what my focus has been on, but I do know that they have ongoing efforts with artificial insemination up in Kenya in Lewa National Park, working on that. And a good person's work for you guys to maybe look into is one of the photographers through National Geographic, Amy Vitale. She's done an incredible job covering that story of the northern white rhino. So while the situation right now, there's still a lot of science going on, there potentially could be, a future where we see the ability to maybe impregnate one of those female northern white rhinos to preserve the species, but we'll just have to wait and see on that one.
Yeah, so I can give classrooms a little update on that. Just earlier in the week, we hosted an event live from Old Pejeta Conservancy, where the last two northern white rhinos on the planet are being protected and looked after. So we were able to do an event live with the rhinos and live with the rangers who are protecting them. And they did give us a little update that they have three viable embryos that later in the year, they're going to try to put in 3 different southern white rhinos to be surrogate mothers. So there's hope for the species, but there's only 3 left. So it's down to the wire, unfortunately. But that's some pretty big conservation work happening in Kenya. All right, let's take another trip here. Let's go to, looks like we have some students hanging out with us in Dundas here in Canada. Looks like some 4th graders. Let me see if I can get their microphone turned on. There we go. How are we doing, Dundas?
Hey.
All right, looking good. Who's got a question?
Yeah, Jacob.
How come in the black market, why do they sell stuff illegal?
Sorry, you said, why do they sell things illegally on the black market?
Mm.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the black market exists for all kinds of products that you're not able to legally trade. So when we're talking about rhino horn, for example, there's an organization called CITES, which dictates the trade in wildlife. And you cannot, there's a law internationally that you're not allowed to trade rhino horn. The only place that rhino horn is actually allowed to be traded domestically is South Africa, because they lifted a moratorium on the ban. I think it was maybe 2 years ago now. But because there is no legal trade, people turn to using the black market in order to continue to trade those wildlife products. So I hope that answers your question. I can keep talking to go a little deeper, but surface level, that's how it works.
Yeah, exactly. A place where you can find things that generally are banned, right? It would be illegal to sell, and it's worth a lot of money. So it's pretty lucrative for people to take part in that kind of trade, that kind of practice. All right, let's take a trip to Austin, Texas this time. 6th graders hanging out with Mrs. Hans. Let me get that microphone turned on. Oh, where did they go? Okay, maybe they had to blink out. All right, switch gears. We'll go to California instead this time. We're gonna go to Mrs. Barha's group, 6th graders in Oxnard. Let's get that microphone turned on. How are we doing, 6th graders? Can you hear me, Mrs. Barhas? There they are. All right. Who's got a question for Tara? All right, we're ready for you, bud.
Okay.
Like to see it? Yeah. How did she get her job at National Geographic?
How did I get my job? So you mean being getting my National Geographic grant? Is that what you mean? Yeah. Okay. So there's a grant application process. So I applied for the grant, and luckily for me, someone at National Geographic thought that actually it's more than just one person. It's the Conservation Research and Exploration Board actually reads through these grants. It goes through multiple rounds of review, and they decide which grants that have been applied for get funding. And I was one of the lucky grants that got funding. So that's when this big adventure of actually being a National Geographic explorer started for me, is when last November of 2019, Nat Geo decided that they were going to fund my grant work in South Africa. And this past summer is when I was able to actually go back to Kruger and spend time doing the research for that. But it sounds simple when I say all you have to do is apply. But there was a lot of things that went into it prior. Like my first trip to Africa was entirely on my own. I think it was something that I knew I always wanted to do, and thought that Nat Geo would be the best place to try and get funding for it. And I'm very happy that that determination worked out for me.
All right, very cool. And we do have a couple high school classes who are tuning in.
Oh, cool.
Our early career grants through National Geographic. So when you jump into college and university, if you have ideas, if you have projects you want to do somewhere, especially around conservation and science, then that could be another really good option to apply for an early career grant with National Geographic. And I know lots and lots of explorers, young explorers who got their start through an early career grant shortly after graduating high school. So really cool opportunities with Nat Geo. All right. Where do we need to go next? There they are. We're gonna go to Courtney, British Columbia this time with some 6th graders hanging out with Mrs. Appleby. Let's get that microphone turned on. How are we doing, BC?
Hey.
All right, who's up?
How many people are killed? How many animals are killed by poachers each year?
How many animals killed by poachers each year? A lot. If we're talking about just animals, you know, I'm not sure the current rate of poaching. I don't have numbers on it, but we're looking at, in terms of rhino, for example, in the next 2 years to 3 years, at the current rate of poaching, we're looking at the likelihood of there being little to no wild rhinos left on the planet, which is kind of a very scary reality, if that gives you a sense. But there are species across the world that are poached for a whole variety of reasons, and rhino are just one of them. Elephants are poached for their tusks. Pangolin are poached for their scales and for their meat. You also have a ton of reptiles and, you know, birds that are poached still alive to be part of the live pet trade. So it's like millions of animals. It's a lot.
All right. And unfortunately, it's a tough thing to combat, and it's not gonna disappear anytime soon. So I think that's why education is has such an important role to play, educating people, especially in some of the Asian countries, about, you know, the benefits of keeping the animals alive, and that some of those medicinal purposes that they think they're getting those benefits actually is a myth and isn't actually true. And a big one I can think of is years ago, people used to think that sharks didn't get cancer. So they thought maybe if we have shark cartilage, that will help. And it's been proven that sharks do in fact get cancer. And I've been diving with sharks with tumors. I've seen the tumors myself. So sometimes education, I think, is a big component to the problem. All right. Let's take a little trip to Mrs. Doak's class. They're joining us in Mankato, Minnesota. Let's get that microphone turned on. There it is. How we doing, Minnesota?
Good. Can you hear us?
We got you.
Excellent. So our question is, did you have to take any safety precautions when you traveled to South Africa and when you were doing your work with National Geographic?
Yeah, certainly. I think especially investigating something like the poaching crisis, I think that there's a lot of sensitivities that I have had to keep in mind. And a lot of situations that I've had myself in that I've needed to be like very aware of my surroundings, and just be focused always on reminding myself that this is a very serious topic that I'm working on. And inevitably, if I want to be able to cover the story and get the perspectives of everyone who's involved, I'm going to be in some situations where it might be a little bit more dangerous than others, right? I've been myself on a follow-up where we arrested 3 poachers. I've been, you know, basically from here to my camera from individuals who've actually been involved with killing wildlife. And in those situations, I've always been surrounded by people who deal with that day in, day out, right? I'm always alongside a ranger. But, you know, I think the main thing that's been important for me is to constantly remind myself that, like, I'm a little bit out of my element, a lot of it out of my element in most of the situations I'm putting myself in. So just be hyper aware, and also like approaching things respectfully at all times. And even if I am interacting with someone who is potentially involved themselves with the poaching crisis, my job is not to be there telling them that what they're doing is wrong. My job is to listen to their perspective. That way I can hear, you know, their side of the story and walk away having a better understanding of the entire situation and keep that, you know, immediate situation a good one as well.
All right. Well, Tara, I'm going to steal a couple quick questions off YouTube to wrap us up. And
Sure.
the first one is about what the poachers take. Is it just the horn they take? And the second one is, what is the penalty if an informant is caught?
Ooh, those are really great questions. Starting with the horn. Most of the time, the horn is what these poachers are after, right? Because that's what's worth money. But there's something that a lot of poachers throughout South Africa believe in, and it's called muti. And so it's basically magic. They believe that they'll go to a medicine man or someone called a sangoma before they go out and poach. And they oftentimes will take the advice of that sangoma very, very seriously. And if they've poached a rhino before, what they'll do is sometimes take the ears of that rhino or take the eyes out. And they believe that either they'll bring it back to the sangoma, and the next time they poach, that'll give them the eyesight and the hearing abilities of that rhino, or it'll also make sure that that rhino can't like hear or see them in the, I think it's like in the future, or sorry, in death, so that they won't get caught. So there's a lot of really interesting beliefs that I'm still trying to wrap my head around that poachers have. But that muti and use of sangomas is something that's really interesting in helping these poachers feel empowered that they'll be able to go in and successfully kill wildlife without getting caught. So they do take other parts of the rhino, but typically it's mostly just taking the horn because that's what they need to get in and out with to make money. And then that second question, remind me, that was what are the penalties, right? Yeah. So I'm really glad you guys asked this question, because it is probably one of the biggest reasons why poaching is still happening as big as it is not only that, you know, syndicates are recruiting people from the inside to give information to poachers that they wouldn't necessarily have otherwise, to find the rhino, to get into the park, to get arms into the park, you name it. But poachers are getting caught by rangers, but because there really aren't strong laws in place and there's not strong enforcement in place, the guys that are getting caught in the bush go immediately, they get brought to the station, to the police station, but they're immediately there met by an attorney that's provided by the syndicates and paid for. So they get out on bail pretty much immediately. So whoever's getting arrested for a rhino poaching crime is getting brought to court and out on bail immediately. So they have the ability to go out into the reserve again and potentially even try to poach another rhino before they're even prosecuted for the first time around. So while rhino poachers are getting caught by these rangers in the park, they're not being able to be kept out of the park because that prosecution element is not there. And I've actually spent a lot of time with one of the lead prosecutors for Kruger, and it's just some of the hardest conversations that I've had have been talking and how much they're up against, how big of a challenge it is to really make sure that once poachers caught, they're kept out of the bush.
All right. Well, Tara, a huge thank you for several reasons. One, for sharing the story of, you know, the people who are working so hard to protect wildlife in Africa, like the rhinos. And thank you for sharing the other side of the story, because, you know, it's not just cut and dry. Sometimes we think about poachers and we don't think about some of the drivers behind it. And in a lot of cases, people just trying to make a living for their family. So thank you for sharing both sides and for the work you're doing as an investigative journalist. And we look forward to connecting with you soon. We can tell us a little bit more about the project.
Yeah.
Follow-up trip even, maybe. So
stay tuned.
Yeah, very cool. Well, classroom testing. Oh, sorry, Tara, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say thanks a lot to all of you for listening and for the great questions. Yeah, I'm impressed.
All right, the last thing I'm gonna do is turn on the microphones, boys and girls, a nice goodbye and thank you, and then we'll sign off for today. All right, thanks everyone for joining us today. We have one more event to wrap up the month coming up next with Africa Flora Anderson. So if you want to tune into that, that's at 1 p.m. Eastern. Other than that, we'll see you in March for some more events. So we're signing off